was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. This wasn't a regular farm that you would expect with fields full of beans and shit. It was actually a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and so we lived basically in the woods and would bale the pine straw every year. Whatever, the point is that my house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pine. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 30s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground, so you had something of an angle to look out at a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter, it was unsettling because you'd get just a bit of snow, enough to reflect moonlight so that you could see the dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. So now to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend and we were doing what kids do in the country, throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. It is getting late and the fire is dying down, so we build the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room and get ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we hear the dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretches for nearly a mile, so I just assumed they were chasing off whatever animal felt like shitting in my yard. So my cousin is staring out the window and not saying anything, which prompts the standard "what's up?" He just kind of keeps staring and says he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I get all anxious and start staring out the window as well. Nothing happens for a few minutes and he gets more and more annoyed with me because I'm asking what he saw. He keeps shushing me so that he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, just a brisk walk from one tree to another. This is probably 100 yards out from the house. We can't actually tell if the person is coming closer or not because we're dealing with moonlight reflecting off of the ice. I guess the crazy part is that we didn't so much freak out because at this point, there is still that chance that we didn't see what we saw, so we just kept staring. We should have gone to wake up my dad, but he's an idiot and the kind of guy to walk out on the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. We were just scared enough to agree that we don't want to taunt whatever is happening. So about 3 minutes later, it happens again, but a good 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This happened every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point, I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was federal paper. I don't know who owns it now. So it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. So we keep watching as these two figures intermittently appear and vanish until finally we see one appear, but not disappear. Instead, we focus in on it and see that it is now running forward. We lose our shit and go wake my dad. By the time we get into the room with my half-awake father, there is no one to be seen. We sprint around, locking doors and windows. Keep in mind that we're out in the country with no one around. It rarely occurs to lock doors. Every door was worse than the last because you just know that as soon as you reach the door, someone is going to be trying to open it, although that never happened. We locked everything up, walked around the house at least 50 times, making sure no one got in without us knowing, and then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this, we take care of our own mentality, and it simply wasn't an option to call 911. The next day we went out to look, and absolutely, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between trees, and then we finally saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. But as I said, I wouldn't have seen them, because while I'm 7 feet up in the living room, they would have been right beneath me. I was 16 and woke up in the middle of the night to seeing my clothes being rustled about in my doorway. After washing my clothes, I like to hang dry them on my door frame. I notice some really gray, veiny-looking legs, and then I see these really long, pointed sticks moving through my clothes. It took me a second, but my sleepy eyes adjusted to see one of the most grotesque, demon-looking things I have ever seen. He was extremely skinny and had a distended stomach. His skin was gray and veiny, and those long sticks were his fingers. His chin was long, his eyes had no lids on them, and were unusually big. His tiny mouth was in a pucker and moved like he was eating an imaginary lollipop. His hunchback looked as though it tore out of the strange hospital gown he was wearing. He just stared at me, and I tried to scream my grandmother awake, who was sharing a room with me for the weekend. He wouldn't stop staring, and I stared back and tried to shake my grandmother awake. I started noticing other things about him, like how large and cone-like his head was, and how hairless and shriveled he looked as he stood still, seemingly surprised I could see him. My grandmother woke up, looked towards the door, and he was gone. In the weeks leading to this encounter, I had been experiencing strange things in my house, like my bedroom door slamming and locking on its own. One night I woke up to what felt like several hands touching my feet and legs and horrible nightmares. After the experience with this strange gray man, I told my parents and they had my room exorcised. I don't know if an exorcism really made those horrible things stop or gave me peace of mind from things I was manifesting myself. All I know is I don't experience those things anymore and I'll never sleep with a door open again. When I was about 13 years old, our dog ran away from home. This happened a few times, as the gate in the back was left open due to family members being careless and not ensuring it closed all the way. And she got out, usually not a big deal. The neighborhood we were in was a pretty okay neighborhood and I could usually find her not that far away. Sniffing at things, usually in the alleys behind houses as that's where people set out their trash, etc., etc. She was just curious, and the minute she'd see me, she'd drop whatever she was after and come straight to me. We'd head home. No biggie. This one time it happened, though. I went looking for her and couldn't find her. I started to get a bad feeling and kept looking. Probably a good 6 blocks away, further than she'd ever roamed before, was an area with a bunch of townhomes rental properties. She'd never gone that far before, and I was nearly in tears, ready to give up and go home to wait for her to hopefully find her way back this time instead, as I'd been out. Probably for almost an hour trying to find her at this point, walking around, when I saw some slight movement behind a wooden fence and thought I heard a yip. In this random person's backyard was my dog. She was muddy and wet, and they'd chained her to a post in the yard. She was pulling at the chain, barking and trying to get to me. It was pretty far away, so I assumed that the people had decided to take her in having seen her running around or something. I knew it was her because she was my dog, damn it, and I knew it was her. And also she had her collar on. I'll never forget what happened next. I rang the doorbell. An older dude opened the door after I rang the bell a second time, having given it a good 20 seconds and hearing people inside yelling. "Yes," he said, looking at me through a crack in his door. "Hi, my name is Jamie and I'm here about my dog. I'm so happy you found her and thank you for getting her off the streets." He looked at me suspiciously. "What dog?" he said, staring at me. "What? My dog? The little white dog you have in your backyard?" I replied. I was starting to get really creeped out at this point. "We have no dog here," he said, and tried to close the door on me. I stopped the door with my foot. "The dog in your backyard. Right there." I was getting louder at this point as I was starting to panic a little. I pointed towards his backyard and my dog started to bark frantically. He looked in the direction I was pointing, looked back at me, sort of made a disappointed or annoyed grimace and said, "Oh, that dog," rather unconvincingly. Then he left the doorway. I was totally mystified and more than a little frightened at this point. So I went back around to the yard and was ready to climb over the fence and just take my dog back myself when he came to the patio door of his yard. Stepped into the yard with her. She cowered far, far away from him, I noticed, and unchained her from the post, then stepped over and opened his gate. She booked it to me and pretty much leaped into my arms as I kneeled down to meet her, and the old dude just wordlessly walked back inside with a scowl on his face. I have no idea what would have happened if I hadn't wandered out that far to find her, but he didn't seem to have any intention of returning her or calling the pound or anything. Her collar had her license tag information on it as well as her owner's information on another tag, so his family could have dealt with it, but it didn't seem like they had any intention of doing so. I got the worst feeling from that guy. After that, if she ever got out of the yard again, she was never more than about 50 feet from the house fence boundaries. We even found her waiting patiently outside the gate to the backyard, once. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night we were really bored, and he suggested we go explore the house next door since it had sat empty for a while. We go around back, and there's a dog door that he can crawl through, and he unlocks the door and lets me in. The house itself is really unremarkable. It looked like it was built in maybe the 1950s and was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. My friend's house was similarly built. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against a picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could see the streetlight through the window. My friend and I sit down on the floor across from this table and are just hanging out, talking. Why? Who knows? All of a sudden, my friend screams, and in that instant, my vision goes black. But it wasn't that I just couldn't see. My body was engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I start screaming and I feel my friend's hand grabbing mine and pulling me in some direction forcefully. My vision slowly comes back and I start to warm up when I realize that we're outside under the streetlight. It was December and should have been much warmer inside of that house. Finally, I look at my friend and he looks scared. I'm really confused and kind of panicked myself and finally ask him what happened. He says that as I was talking, a black thing, this figure that was all black and only had the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from under the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out he pulled me out of the house. We're still friends and we bring it up every now and then, but the story itself never changes, and it still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple of days afterward, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. I always thought that ghosts were a figment of our imagination, something that existed only in stories and movies. That was until I moved into my new apartment. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a few weeks, strange things started happening. I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, but when I went to check, no one was there. Objects would move on their own, and doors would slam shut when there was no wind. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room. It was transparent and seemed to be made of mist. I couldn't believe my eyes. I froze, unable to move or even scream. The figure began to move towards me, and I felt a cold breeze on my face. I could feel its presence getting stronger, and my heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, the figure disappeared and everything went quiet. I was left alone in the dark, trembling with fear. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I spent the rest of the week trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the following night, the figure returned. It was closer this time, and I could see that it was a woman. She seemed to be reaching out to me, and I could feel her cold breath on my face. I was too scared to move or scream, and I just lay there frozen in terror. After that night, the figure appeared every night. She would come closer and closer until I could almost touch her. I tried to ignore her, but I couldn't. I was terrified, and I knew I had to do something. I spoke to my landlord, and he told me that the apartment building was built on an old cemetery. He said that many people had reported seeing ghosts in the building, and that some had even moved out because they couldn't handle the paranormal activity. I knew I had to get out of there. I packed my bags and left the apartment that night. As I was leaving, I saw the figure in the hallway. She was smiling, and I could feel her presence even as I walked out of the building. I will never forget my experience in that apartment. It taught me that ghosts are real and that sometimes there's no escaping the horrors of the supernatural.